Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to apologize. I'm not feeling too well, so you might hear me cough every now and then. It's a good excuse also because sometimes I might not be able to get something across, so I can always blame my cough for it. I'm also indebted to the presenters who came before me because they saved me considerable time trying to explain concepts. And one of the things I find challenging in my thesis, trying to unwrap complex terms and terminologies. So I am grateful to some of them, at least for sort of unwrapping some of that already before me. I've titled my presentation today, Young Ulama as Custodians of Change. And those of you who know, this is sort of an adaptation from Muhammad Qasim Zaman's sort of work in terms of ulama and scholarship. So I've kind of borrowed some of his ideas from there. I also want to just talk about a little bit about my own research. So my thesis provides a rich tapestry of the everyday lived reality of life in an Islamic seminary, a Darul Uloom, in the north of England for the very first time. So this is the first time that we've had, or someone's been able to get access to a Darul Uloom and sort of engage in detailed ethnographic research, which primarily involves participant observation for over a year and lots of interviews, 25 formal interviews, but lots of informal interviews as well, many, maybe just as many informal interviews as well. So lots of data was captured during my time in a seminary in the north of England. So I've got some pictures there. I've been told this is the first time such pictures are publicly available. So I'm going to flick through them quickly before someone pinches them. So these are some of the pictures. They help sort of gain a perspective of what life is like in a Darul Uloom. And in my thesis, I try and explain this idea of respect for knowledge and the idea of the sacrality of knowledge, and show that students sitting on the floor, there's a sort of idea behind the philosophy behind the whole idea of sitting on the floor and so forth and so on. And that's some more pictures of inside the seminary and the class taking place there as well. My contribution, I hope, when the thesis, inshallah, God willing, is completed, will contribute to debates about the sociology of religious professionals, religious education and formation, and changing patterns of religious authority and leadership within the Islamic tradition. There's a lot in there. In fact, I actually have an entire chapter, just 10,000 words or more, dedicated just to unpacking what tradition actually means. Because lots of times we say, oh, he's a traditional scholar, he's traditionally trained. What does that actually mean? And I've gone off on a tangent and spent 10,000 words talking about what we mean by tradition. And when people use that word, what does it actually mean? And also on authority, I've spent just as many words trying to unpack what authority actually means in Islamic tradition, at least, as well. And that's just sort of a comment from one of my interviewees who I interviewed, and he talked about this idea that every Darul Uloom graduate is an authority or is a leader in some role. So whether he's working in a shop, just managing the counter, he has a role, or he's working in a superstore, the Muslim workers who work with him would see him as the Imam of that particular store. So everyone has a sort of leadership role, or even in his family, everybody will WhatsApp him questions about religion and masail and questions that they'll have. So everybody has a sort of leadership role, and this is why I kind of complicate it all, because we sort of see a leader as someone who stands at the front and is leading a congregation, but a lot of these people also are leaders in their own special way as well. So I want to just split my presentation today into three very broad parts. The first part, I just want to sort of map the landscape in terms of the scholarship that's been produced thus far on religious authority. And then secondly, I want to talk about my own sort of findings on the modalities, as I call it, of authority within a particular seminary that I research. And finally, I want to talk about what might be significant, I hope, is some of the implications this has for religious authority outside of the Darul Uloom setting, and the consequent impact of the formation on the formation of future British Muslim leadership. And so, in my thesis, I sort of spend a lot of time talking about unpacking about how scholars have talked about in the past in various fields about how religious authority is constructed and constrained. So let me just sort of let me just qualify some of my statements. What I mean by religious authority is that the adjective religious recognizes that there exists in Islam other modes or modalities or legitimacies of authority that emerge after the charismatic authority of the Prophet. So while there are various modalities of the Prophet's authority, for my purposes at least, I'm primarily interested in the religious authority of the Prophet. So I've kind of provided a tentative framework which I then develop in my thesis about how I believe or how I see religious authority being constructed in Islam. So the framework for the construction, I'll try and explain that sort of diagram there, is that the framework for the construction of religious authority begins with a shared epistemological presupposition. This is the belief in the tradition of a normative system, in this case the Quran, Sunnah, and the consensus of the Ummah, which is what we call Ijma. However, historically, due to the absence of a formal institution of authority, and we sort of have that today as well in Islam, interpretation of this norm requires specialists. So there's a need for specialists. So the ulama then were constructed as the de facto religious authority on the interpretation of Islam. And so the ulama then become a special group, and this special group is an authority because of their perceived, and this word is very important, their perceived competence and special understanding of God's instructions, and therefore their authority is based in many ways on social perception and trust. And I unpack a lot of this in my thesis. So this was also reflected in the practical needs to untie the complex meanings of revelation with the aid of specialists. So a combination of traditional norms and the needs of the Ummah defines religious authority, and this is what broadly a lot of the literature says. So building on this theory, my next part of my presentation looks at the various modalities of authority in my particular research. Now it's very, very important to bear in mind that the word authority is not actually used in the Darul Uloom. So they don't talk about he's an authority in that term, but it's an important analytical category that helps us to understand how authority is constructed in the seminary as well. I should also bear out, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, that often when I present, people assume that I'm speaking on behalf of all the Darul Ulooms that exist in modern Britain. I don't speak on behalf of any Darul Uloom, but I'm just an academic researcher who spent time in a Darul Uloom and is talking about his own experiences, because sometimes people feel like he's defending and he's sort of out there. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just here to present what my research actually says. So one of the interesting things that I found in my own research, and this diagram somehow I try and encapsulate what I saw in the Darul Uloom, is that authority is based on a trinity of piety, perceived piety that the teacher, and this is in particular for the senior teachers. So I have an analytical category where I look at the senior teachers and the younger teachers, and I'll talk about younger teachers in a second. So the perception, at least, or the idea that they have piety, taqwa, knowledge, and the awe that the teachers sort of have as well. So you always see this respect and reverence for their teachers as well. So this is like a trinity that I call that they have, and this is something that is sustained piety as well. And why I say sustained piety and religious learning is that it's embodied. Its embodiment, though cultivated individually, leads to a greater level of public respect from a community who share the same epistemological framework. So people see that and they respect them because of their knowledge and their piety and their learning. And it's sustained. It's not performative, right? It's a sustained. It's something. It's a malaka, as we say. It's something that they've developed over such an extended period of time. And this signals a sincerity that the Muslim public are then able to receive as well. Also, so that's one perspective. Another reason senior teachers have a level of authoritativeness is that it's the teaching of hadith, which is seen in some ways superior, if I can use that word, to the teaching of fiqh. And this is, so when we talk about hadith, we're talking about prophetic traditions, and when we're talking about fiqh, we're talking about Islamic jurisprudence. And so hadith is seen in some ways as superior, and you can understand this by the fact that in the later years or towards the end of their studies, students spend a lot more time with the hadith tradition. And so this is one of the reasons I explained this, is that they see the Prophet as the authoritative role model, and therefore hadith is a way of trying to emulate and embody the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And so this adds to the teacher who's teaching this, who's imparting this knowledge, a sense of authoritativeness. I keep using the word authoritativeness. The reason being is there's not clear set boundaries. There isn't someone who's sitting at the top and he's an authority. there are levels and shades of authoritativeness. I really want to talk about the junior teachers, so I'm going to move on. Now we have the junior teachers who are also authoritative in certain ways as well, and that's really, really interesting as well. So the senior teachers have authority in terms of teaching and text, and in their public sort of relationship in terms of outside of the community, but the junior teachers also have a form of interesting relationship with the Darul Uloom and authority as well. So they're all British born and educated. They are more than just teachers, which is very, very interesting. So a lot of them actually teach in the school. The school in this particular Darul Uloom is an outstanding school. It has an excellent reputation for teaching and so forth and so on. And many of these teachers are also teachers in the Darul Uloom, the traditional seminary. So what they do is they bring a lot of their professionalization, a word's been used before, and their experiences into the classroom as well. And they're also heavily involved in the management and decision making that takes place in the seminary as well. They're alumni, many of them, and they have played an important role in translating many of the text. So a sort of mini Baghdad translation movement is taking place as well into English as well. So they have a lot of text that they've produced as well. Importantly, they also have a very good relationship with the principal, and he's known for being a visionary, and his authority is best described as paternalistic. For the younger generation of teachers, he is recognized as someone who maintains a strong relationship with subordinates through his dialogical and consultative form of decision making. So this is sort of like, I kind of bring all the theory and all the empirical evidence together and sort of develop a diagram where I look at how the levels and the modalities of authority work within the Darul Uloom. So you have the broader management team sort of sitting in the middle and the principal, and then you have the junior staff on the right hand side. And when they want to implement changes in the Darul Uloom, they don't sort of enforce it upon the senior teachers, it goes through the principal. And there's this sort of dialogical relationship that takes place. But in many ways, they are the ones who are driving change in the seminary through their own experiences. Okay, so the young ulama, the principal recognizes, and this is a quote from him, he recognizes that things need to change, and the people who will drive this change are the younger generation of teachers. And so given, I mean, this is well documented in academic research, that the conservative nature of the Deobandi movement, this makes his leadership, his style of leadership, quite distinctive. And the fact that he's allowed me to conduct research in his seminary signals his outward-facing stance as well. And the fact that he places trust in his young teachers. By the way, this doesn't mean there's a sort of antagonistic relationship between the senior teachers and the younger teachers. They seem to get on. The senior teachers are really busy running the mosque and being an imam, and they respect the fact that the younger teachers are able to take the Darul Uloom forward. So there's a recognition of passing over the baton, if you like, to the younger teachers. I'm running out of time. So these are some of the challenges that some forms of authority are facing in Darul Uloom. So with the idea of individualization, second generation Muslims, we are seeing individualized private Islam, and sort of, I mean, I'll let the slides speak for themselves a little bit there rather than to save time. And in a culture of inter-religious pluralism as well, so people are now able to access with social media and inter-religious pluralism are able to access different types of Islam or different approaches to Islam as well. So this is a sort of challenge to their authority. Social media is another one that's quite prominent now. And obviously in the West, we have mass education literacy as well, compared to previous points in Muslim history as well. However, and I want to sort of finish with this, is transformation is taking place among the young generation of ulama and graduates. They are acting as, I use the word bricoleurs, and they are creating new forms of hybridization while remaining within the ambit of tradition. And success, one of my conclusions at the end of, I hope, 80,000 words or more, is that the success depends a lot on the individual student taking ownership and having some sort of moral agency to become an authority or a leader. So the Darul Uloom will give you the tools, and this all goes down to the question about, and when we talk about Darul Ulooms are not doing enough or they're not producing leaders, the question really is, have we asked what the Darul Ulooms think they are doing? You know, because it's all based on what we think they should be doing. We're projecting our own sort of views on the Darul Uloom, and my research sort of asked the Darul Uloom themselves the question, what do you think you're doing? And the common response is, we're passing on a tradition, we're transmitting knowledge, and we're trying to create a pious person, right? So nowhere in there do you find this idea, we're trying to create future leaders, right? That's up to the student himself to take ownership. I'll just conclude by saying that I hope that my thesis will contribute to debates, inshallah, around the idea of religious professionals, religious education and formation, and changing patterns of religious authority and leadership within the Islamic tradition. Thank you very much.